The clerk hammered the notice to the oak and folded the paper back so it sat flush against the carved panel. Suspicion rose in the quiet archivist as he stepped forward and read the line that named whole shelves for removal. He caught the clerk's wrist before the man could close the ledger and demanded an explanation in a voice held low and steady. The clerk kept his ledger pressed to his chest and said, "The dean ordered a review. We move tomorrow. He is the quiet archivist. He has kept keys on a cord and an ink-stained thumb for 3 decades. He moves through the stacks by memory and by touch, knowing which spines will shave to dust if handled roughly, and which margins hold a student's frantic corrections. He keeps a tiny private list in a pocket watch case and polishes brass until the metal glows the color of lamp, gold. Those facts mattered now because a single line on a university memorandum could turn careful preservation into hurried transfer. The crowd on the steps was small but sharp. A porter leaned on a broom. An undergrad craned his neck. The clerk adjusted his wig and read the order aloud so the words landed hard. Immediate inventory and transfer under university authority. The archivist's jaw tightened. He counseled clerk, "Show me the seal." The clerk flicked the seal across a thumb. "You know the seal, Mr. Hale," he said. He kept his tone even. The archivist's first emotion, suspicion, bent his attention toward procedure. He wanted to know whether this was routine or targeted. He wanted to know who judged the books unfit to remain where they slept. The suspicion moved him into action. He pushed past the crowd and stepped beneath the lamp over the threshold. Inside, the hall smelled of beeswax and cold paper. The quiet archivist did not waste words. He called to the apprentice scholar and set the notice on the nearest reading table. "Anna, fetch the spare key. Check the rear wing." Anna obeyed without pause and rubbed her palms where they had small colluses from book binding. Her movements were brisk and practical. She had been his apprentice for 2 years and had learned to read the room as well as the script. They walked the nearest stacks together. The archivist ran a hand along spines he knew by scar and smudge. He found a new lock on a seldom used door and a narrow trail of disturbed dust that led past an alcove, under a lintel, and into the wing. He crouched, tracing the line with the back of his finger. The disturbance differed from years of neglect. It was fresh, edged, human. "Anna," someone came in. The quiet archivist answered, then someone left a trail. He moved without hesitation to the door and tried the pad. The key turned with a soft, reluctant sound. Electricity was not required for a human intent to set a lock. This was human work, not decay. They entered the rear wing and the lantern light made leather spines gleam like dull coins. Anna lifted a folio so the archivist could read the title. He paused at a shelf whose label had always been blank on purpose. A visiting student stood in the shadow between stacks with a posture that showed neither guilt nor surprise. He held his hand in a pocket and looked directly at the archivist. The student folded a small note and set it on the shelf. "I found this where you said nothing lived," he told the archivist. "There are names tucked into the margins. Someone writes to them." The archivist's hands tightened on the folio. He nodded once and asked, "Who are you?" "Elias. Visiting for a month, sir." His voice was plain and steady. "I came because an old tutor sent a sheet." Elias had eyes that catalogued patterns quickly and a gait that belonged to someone used to library hours. He produced a folded memorandum stamped with the university seal and slid it across the table. The memorandum instructed that certain volumes be set aside for institutional review. The archivist read the header and then the list of titles. "This list is partial." He tapped a title and found, beneath the printed line, a recent marginal note written in a hand he almost recognized. The marginalia pointed, thin and deliberate, to an adjacent shelf labeled with a name he had not opened in years. Anna leaned in and traced the ink with a fingertip. "Someone marked these," she said. "Someone with access." The archivist's suspicion shifted. It became the blunt force of anger when the Dean of Records arrived through the doorway with a bailiff at his elbow. He wore his robes as though the weight of them could make the law heavier. He carried a list in his hands and read with brisk clarity, "We inventory now. Prepare items for transfer, Din the archivist. These volumes require careful cataloguing. Removal risks damage. He set his palm on a chest of books as if naming them by touch could keep them from moving. The dean folded the list once and placed it on the table. "Mr. Hale, the university commands this. You will not impede." The bailiff's fingers closed briefly on the edge of the chest. The tension rose. The quiet archivist spoke with slow, deliberate sentences. "Dean of Records, please. If you remove them without notes, we will lose provenance." "Those marginalia are part of the work." The dean's reply was clipped. "Provenance is not part of the university's current concern. Order is." His voice carried the authority that ends conversation. Elias slid the folded note from his coat and spread it between them. The note contained an annotation that linked several volumes to disputed research and to a scholar who had been asked to step away from teaching. The page bore a name the archivist had not expected to see. A faculty member who had once pushed the university toward an experimental line of inquiry and then quietly been reassigned. The annotation suggested suppression. "Anna, this is why they want them moved." The dean's eyes narrowed, but his voice stayed the same. "If there is a question of suppression, that is a matter for the council. For tonight, we inventory." The bailiff began to tick items off on the list, as if the act of ticking made the books lighter. The archivist allowed the rising anger to shape his next move. He had long arguments with the dean in his head, but the immediate choice was direct and physical. At the long oak table beneath the brass lamp, the bailiff reached for a chest bound in old leather. The quiet archivist moved faster than he seemed capable of moving. He slipped one heavy folio into his satchel and placed his hand over it. "I cannot surrender this chest without proper notes," he said. "The bailiff, you will give it." A short argument flared. "Dean, look at the marginalia," the archivist urged. "Those notes link to the registrar's own entries." "This is not idle trivia." The dean answered, "You are obstructing a university order." The bailiff advanced, and a visiting student stepped between them, because he saw the book, because he knew the folio-s frontispiece from a lecture, or because he could not watch a book taken without an attempt to understand why it mattered. There were 3 to 6 rapid lines of speech then, quick and tense. "Mr. Hale, hand it over." "Dean, you cannot." "Bailiff, remove the satchel." "Elias, stay back." "Anna, document this." The archivist's fingers tightened on the satchel strap. He pushed a chair back with his foot so it scraped against the floor. Someone knocked over a stack and a single sheet fluttered. It landed face up and the script on it made the dean pause. The script on that sheet showed a footnote that named an omitted funder and a notation that suggested deliberate redaction years earlier. The dean's voice lost a measure of certainty. "Where did this come from?" "Anna, from a folio under this chest." "Someone has been making notes across the collection." The bailiff's posture changed. He looked toward the doorway as if he expected reinforcements, though none came. The feeling in the room shifted from public order to private worry. The archivist's suspicion moved to fear when he realized the removal was not administrative only. It masked a purge. He felt his hands tremble when he thought of loose folios slipping into hands that valued only immediacy. He did not show the trimmer. He changed tactics. He opened his satchel. He laid the heavy folio on the table and opened to a page with names. He read aloud certain lines and said, "These belong to people who gave testimony, letters and notes. The university owes them careful handling." The dean's jaw worked. Elias leaned over the folio and pointed to a marginal line that spelled out a meeting and a date. "Elias," the dean voice sharpening, "you are a visitor. This is not your place." Elias kept his gaze steady. "Dean, the notes show suppression. If records disappear, who will answer?" The dean tapped the list, breathed, and then signaled the bailiff. The bailiff advanced again, and the archivist, in a small, quick move, closed his fingers over the folio and slipped it back into his satchel. That action became the pivot. The bailiff reached, the archivist braced, and Anna called, "Mr. Hale, you cannot carry that out alone." The student, Elias, said, "You will be charged if you leave with it." The archivist met Elias's eyes, and then the dean's. He did not speak for 2 full heartbeats. He placed the satchel over his shoulder and said, "Then charge me and let it be on record." The dean hesitated. He barked, "Bailiff, detain me." Hale a moment. The bailiff moved forward and the archivist took 2 steps backward, leading with his shoulder against the table to keep the chest between them and the hall. Anna stepped to his side and said, "If you touch him, you touch the reading room dean." Her voice thinned with a strain that suggested fear and resolve at once. The dean glanced at his list and at the sheet on the floor. He considered the university's liability and the council's eyes. He made a choice that lowered but did not remove the pressure. He said, "Meh. Hale, you will be permitted to inventory 1 chest under supervision. Others will be sealed." He lifted his chin and added, "Prepare that chest for transfer by dawn." When the dean left with the bailiff, the hall drained of people in an orderly exodus. The archivist remained at the table with his satchel closed. Elias lingered in the doorway. Anna began to write names onto a scrap of paper with a pen that made a thin scraping sound. The archivist opened the satchel and took out the folio he had risked most for. He turned the pages slowly by necessity, not sentiment. The folio contained letters and lecture notes, lists of sources, and a piece of correspondence with an official signature. He read the words with the measured care of someone who knows 1 misread line can misplace a life. He found marginalia that referenced other volumes and a notation that used an uncommon ink color. The notation pointed to a neglected archive the archivist had shelved once and never touched again. Outside, rain began to patter against the library windows, and the lamps slid warm pools across the floor. Anna looked up from her list. "If they seal the wing, we'll lose the cross references," she said. Elias added, "There are student notes tied to unpublished lectures. The public will never see that context." The archivist closed the folio and set it on the table between them. He felt a shift beneath the anger and fear resolve. His next decision reflected that shift. We will not stop every order. We will choose what to protect. He took the folio from the table and placed it into a small wooden box he kept for fragile bindings. He took the brass key from his cord, turned it twice, and pushed the box behind a row of folios marked with a call number he had used as a hiding place in an earlier, quieter time. He wrote a single line on Anna's scrap, Shelf 3, Ledger 2 folio, the dean's inventory began at dawn. Men with carts rolled through the hall and called out numbers. The archivist stood by a stone windowsill and let the light warm his face. He set the box on the ledge and opened a private ledger that would not be part of the official registry. He wrote names and locations in a cramped hand, listing the folio and a quick note about provenance. He wrote the first entry and placed the pen down with a click. He did not boast or deliver a speech. He made a list. The action resolved the chapter's immediate conflict. 1 folio remained in his care. The immediate threat had passed enough for him to plan clandestine preservation rather than public preservation. He closed the ledger and turned the page. Dawn broadened into a pale wash over the courtyard. The dean's men carried a sealed chest out the main doors under watchful eyes. The archivist watched them go, and then returned to the stacks to find the shelf whose dust had been disturbed the night before. He traced the trail again and found an extra slip of paper tucked behind a binding. It named a small local patron who had quietly paid for repairs and asked for privacy. The archivist folded that slip and hid it inside his ledger. At the window, he set the wooden box on the sill and breathed in the scent of dry paper and beeswax. He touched the brass key and felt the cold metal. He looked at Anna and said, "We begin a ledger here." Anna nodded and took up the pen. Elias stood near the doorway with a bag of books he had promised to return to a tutor. If you need someone to look up references, Elias will help." The archivist allowed a small acknowledgement and replied, "Thank you, Elias. Keep the list safe." He closed the ledger and slid the folio into the box again. He tied a faded ribbon around it and set the box back where only he and Anna would find it by the code they had made from catalog numbers. The last paragraph of the night was a small, concrete act. He recorded the exact call number and the single visible marginalia line, then he snapped the ledger shut. The dean's decision to inventory had been met with a private decision to preserve. A courier knocked at the librarian's door as the bells began to mark the hour. The archivist stood and went to answer, ledger under his arm. He opened the door, met the courier's expectant face, and received a note from the council that requested a formal list by noon. He folded the council's request and placed it on the table. He then put his hand on the wooden box, secure behind a row of spines, and heard Anna counting aloud the names she had copied. Outside, a cart rolled down the lane with several sealed crates strapped in. The quiet archivist watched it pass, and then returned to the stone windowsill where the box waited. He set the ledger open at the page he had written on and added one more line. First folio secured. Cross. Reference pending. He closed the ledger. He tied the ribbon on the box once more and slid it fully behind the marked folios. The final line of the chapter is an action unchanged by rhetoric. The archivist lifts the brass key, slides it into the box's tiny hasp, and turns it until it clicks. The box is closed and a private record begins on the page beside it. The crate skidded against the oak and the quiet archivist grabbed its lip with both hands to stop it before it reached the service door. Suspicion tightened his shoulders the moment he felt the crate's vibration. He had not expected any shipment at this late hour. Stop here, and his voice cut across the corridor. A porter cursed and let the crate lean back into him. That sudden contact, that unannounced transfer made the problem clear. Books were leaving the library without full record, and the quiet archivist would not let it pass. He remembered the clerk hammering the notice to the door in the morning. The paper folded so the oak hid the clerk's uneven handwriting. That notice had named whole shelves for removal. This crate made the notice real. He pulled his hands away and measured the box with his eyes. The porter, a man called Ellis, held the crate's rope with both palms and was breathing hard from the roll. Ellis, whose crate is this? The quiet archivist. The porter tightened his grip and shoved the rope a little farther away. No name, sir. Stamp for transport. Steward's orders, Ellis. His voice was blunt. His hands were steady. The quiet archivist watched the porter's boots and the edge of the crate where the wood had been shaved for the rope. He felt suspicion shift toward determination. If the crate left, a portion of the stacks would vanish. He would need proof before dawn. He called for the clerk who had been mentioned in the notice. Clerk, he said, bring out the ledger. Now, the clerk, small and quick-fingered, came from the anteroom with a candle still gripping wax along his sleeve. The quiet archivist saw the way the clerk's eyes darted toward the service door where other men waited. The clerk's name was Hargreaves. Hargreaves, whose order is this. Hargreaves drew breath and stepped closer to the ledger table as if the book would protect him. There is an authorization, Hargreaves. He pushed the ledger open with a finger and pointed to a stamped mark. It is stamped. It says the university approved deaccession. The quiet archivist's suspicion sharpened into anger. He leaned over the ledger and read the line. The word stamped there used a hand he did not recognize. He snapped the ledger shut and grabbed Hargreaves' wrist. Who signed this? He demanded. Hargreaves winced and tried to pull free. I don't know the hand, sir. It was presented with the form. The steward signed it earlier. Hargreaves began, then faltered under the archivist's steady grip. Outside, a whisper of movement announced more men near the loading ramp. The quiet archivist felt his doubt move into resolve. He could not raise university council at dawn and expect delay. Crates would be on the wagon within an hour. He ordered Hargreaves to produce the disposal order now, in the ledger room, and to keep his hands on the book until the steward could be summoned. Hargreaves obeyed in short breaths. Hargreaves, remain by the ledger and do not let anyone near it. The quiet archivist, and then he strode into the corridor. The crate's lid was nailed down. The porter, Ellis, stood with his back to the light, and the quiet archivist could see dust on the crate's top where sandals had brushed. Open it. Ellis looked to the men by the door who would be offended by delay. Sir, we have orders, Ellis answered. The quiet archivist set his brass key on the crate's edge, turned the key in his hand, and tapped the nail with the heel of his hand to test wood. Do you want to carry it on your conscience, Ellis? Ellis blinked. He set a shoulder against the crate, and, together, they pried up a nail. When the lid came loose, cloth-wrapped folios breathed dust into the corridor. The quiet archivist crouched and lifted the cloth with care. He found books bound in soft leather, some stamped with the university arms, others with faded family seals. One small volume slid free and a scrap of paper fell from between its pages. He unfolded the scrap and read a line in cramped marginal handwriting. A name and a year. It was a scholar's ownership mark. The quiet archivist held the paper until his fingers stopped trembling. What had been an abstract list of titles on a notice was now names, inked by hands who had read beneath these lamps. Suspicion turned to grief. He straightened and called for the steward. "Where did you get these?" He asked the clerk who had come to the crate slip with the ledger tucked under his arm. Hargraves pointed to the stamp inside the folio, and then at the disposal authorization, the registrar asked for duplicates to be removed. Funds were low and space was needed. That is what the stamp says. The quiet archivist's jaw tightened. He ran his thumb over the ownership mark until the ink smudged onto his skin. That smudge made the decision personal. He found the novice scholar next. The dim undergraduate reading room held one student bent over a slate. The quiet archivist sat across the table without asking, and placed the scrap of paper in front of the young man. "Do you know where this came from?" The archivist. The student, called Thomas, lifted his head and blinked. Thomas read the name and swallowed. "My tutor mentioned a purge." "Thomas? They say the faculty wants to sell older holdings to pay for repairs. They think these are duplicates." The quiet archivist felt a second emotional shift. Anger moved into urgent action. He could not rely on rumor. He needed official speech, a name that could be pinned. He pushed back his shawl and said, "Thomas, where did your tutor hear this?" Thomas hesitated. "From the faculty meeting last week." The professor of moral philosophy spoke of removing redundant volumes. Buyers in the city had already been contacted. That revelation made the quiet archivist hard and quick. He went to the registrar's candlelit office with Thomas at his side. The door was narrow. The registrar, a man named Lyle, sat behind a pile of wrapped documents and did not rise. Lyle's hands were steady on a paper weight. The archivist placed the folio spread open on Lyle's desk. "Lyle, explain this," he said. "Who authorized the removal?" Lyle read the folio, his lips barely moving. "We have duplicates. We must be practical. The university is short on coin. Selling redundant volumes secures funds for the college's upkeep." Lyle. His voice was even. "This is not your decision alone, archivist. The council approved a cull. The stamp is valid." The quiet archivist felt a new shift, from anger to a tight, frustrated disbelief. He leaned forward until his breath warmed the registrar's papers. "The color race is provenance." The quiet archivist. "There are ownership marks. There is marginalia. Our duplicates are not empty shells. You remove names and lives." Lyle did not soften. "We cannot keep everything. Practicality requires choices. You know how many volumes we store. We are not a private collection. What about the marginalia?" The quiet archivist. He jabbed a finger at the folio in the desk lamp. "Do you understand what marginalia does?" Lyle shrugged. "Marginalia is often irrelevant to the curriculum. We retain core texts." The argument escalated into the rapid back and forth the quiet archivist had feared. "Lyle, you cannot sign away names," he said. "Lyle, I demand a full inventory now." "We do not have the time," Lyle answered. "We have auditors. The sale helped pay for the new roof. You promised transparency." The archivist. "You promised consultation." "I have authority." Lyle. "Authority to act in the university's interest." 3 lines of terse exchange became 6. Their voices rose and fell. Thomas stood by the doorway and watched both men. Ellis stayed near the window. Hargraves clutched the ledger. Each sentence punched the tension higher. The registrar finally banged the desk with his palm. "Enough," he said. "The work continues tomorrow. The crates will go." He reached for a small key. "You will not delay the process." The quiet archivist looked at the key in Lyle's hand and understood then that he faced an institutional decision, not an accident. He felt his hope narrow into a plan. He left the office with Thomas and Hargraves at his heels and told them to help him find the storeroom ledger. He Ellis to fetch the porter who had taken the other crates. The men moved now with purpose. The quiet archivist's suspicion had shifted into careful, patient plotting. They found the storeroom locked. The quiet archivist remembered the brass key hung behind the registrar's desk. We will not wait for dawn, Thomas nodded. Hargraves, whose hands shook slightly, said, "We could force the door, sir." "The lock is old." The quiet archivist produced his own small key and tested it against the pad. It would not turn. It was not the key for this door. He glanced at Hargraves and said, "Find something to lever the lock steady. Move slow inside." The storeroom smelled of mothballs and wood polish. A single oil lamp swung when they entered. The quiet archivist ran his fingers over the rows of crates until he found one labeled with the same stamp as the folios they opened. He lifted the lid and found a stack of wrapped volumes, each tied with twine. One bundle bore a cloth tag with a family name. He read the name aloud. Thomas repeated it and then reached for a volume with the same ownership mark the archivist had seen earlier. "This cannot be sold, Thomas. This belongs to the family of Master Alden." An unexpected noise made them freeze. Footsteps outside the storeroom and a voice calling the steward's name. The quiet archivist pressed back against a crate and motioned the others to fall silent. Hargraves' breath was shallow and visible in the lamplight. Ellis' hand rested on his knife. The quiet archivist felt fear tighten his hands, then he tuned that fear into the next move. When the door opened a sliver, they slid the ledger into a sleeve and copied the partial line of entries they could reach. The quiet archivist copied the names into a small notebook and tucked the folio under his shawl. At dawn the service yard was bruised with low light. Crates sat on wagons and men winched them with ropes. The steward, a broad man called Gresham, barked orders. The head registrar, Lyle, stood with a ledger rolled under his arm and no trace of unrest on his face. The quiet archivist stepped forward with Thomas and Hargreaves and set down the folio and his copied line on a stone table. "Gresham, stop the wagon," he said. "Lyle, you must answer for these names. These are not duplicates, these are owned volumes." Gresham laughed and planted his foot against a wheel. "We have orders," he said, "orders from the council." "Pay your respects to the council, Swill." The confrontation sharpened. The quiet archivist displayed the scrap of marginalia and read the line aloud. He watched the men as he spoke. He watched for any change. Hargraves thrust the ledger forward and opened to the stamped page. "Here, Hargreaves, Lyle, here is the authorization. Who signed this?" Lyle's jaw tightened. "I did what was necessary," he said. "The university needs funds." A push became physical. Gresham shoved Hargreaves back. Hargreaves stumbled and the ledger tumbled. Thomas lunged for the book to steady it. The quiet archivist moved between Gresham and the ledger. "You will not take these without record. You will not drive them from our steps without one copy kept here." The steward's hand found the wrist of the man nearest the wagon. The quiet archivist braced and felt his coat tug. Hargreaves cried out. The men around them spoke in rough, short lines. "Move on." Gresham barked. "The wagon leaves." "The order stands. We have names." The quiet archivist. "We will attach a copy to every crate. We will not allow anonymous removal." Lyle's face reddened. He barked an order. Men began to haul ropes. Tension rose to its peak. A crate scraped forward and one man reached for the ledger again. Thomas stood in the crate's path and planted his feet. "Thomas, get out of the way." Gresham snapped. Thomas refused to yield without a note. He cried, "These names matter." Words and hands collided. Hargraves grabbed for the ledger. Ellis stepped forward with a face white and set. There was a brief scuffle, a shove. The quiet archivist felt his own body move before thought. He reached for the ledger and ripped a single folio free, the page that contained the line of names he had copied. He tucked it inside his cloak. The pause that followed felt like a dropped breath. Lyle barked in order to proceed. Men heaved the crate onto the wagon. The wagon rattled away toward the city, and with it went the larger portion of the scheduled crates. The quiet archivist watched the wagon turn the corner and felt emptiness where the shelves should stand. The registrar's men retreated. Gresham spat on the stone and turned back toward the steading. Hargraves stood holding the ledger with one hand and the copied page in the other. He looked at the quiet archivist, as if waiting for instruction. Thomas kept his gaze on the wagon until it disappeared. When the yard fell quieter, the quiet archivist did not surrender. He motioned Thomas and Hargraves to follow him back to the emptied corridor. The stacks where the crates had once been now showed gaps of sunlit dust. He found a low windowsill and slid a single folio into the hollow of stone. He placed beside it the copied line from the missing ledger and then wrapped both in a scrap of cloth. He turned the cloth over twice and tied it with a thin strip of twine. He set the parcel where a visitor might find it against the sill, but where a hurried hand might overlook it. It was small, but it preserved a name and a page of marginalia. Hargraves quietly, "Will that be enough?" The quiet archivist ran his thumb along the tied twine and said, "No. But it is something that will make a difference later. It will show that these shelves held people who read and marked their pages." Thomas nodded and said, "We will copy more tonight." They arranged a plan. To transcribe ownership marks from what remained, to keep a quiet ledger of names until the council could be forced to account. It was not a full victory. The crates were gone. The registrar's order had been executed, but a small act of preservation remained. As dawn brightened into the day, the quiet archivist paused and pressed his hand against the stone windowsill where he had hidden the parcel. He noted the scrape of a cart wheel in the street below and the distant bell of a student's summoning class. He felt suspicion relax into a steady, patient resolve. The chapter of removal would continue. The quiet archivist had prevented an anonymous erasure for now, but understood the larger fight would take time and allies. He set his satchel over his shoulder and walked back toward the ledger room with Thomas and Hargraves at his side. He kept the copied folio folded in his inner pocket. The music of voices in the halls rose as the university moved into its day. The quiet archivist sensed a small, concrete shift. A decision made, a page saved, a name kept against an indifferent ledger. He did not claim triumph. He did not promise a final victory. He only tightened the strap of his satchel, adjusted his spectacles, and said, "We will begin tonight. Copy every ownership mark you can find." Hargraves answered with a short, steady, "Yes, sir." Thomas echoed, "Yes, sir." They entered the ledger room together, and the quiet archivist placed the brass key on the desk and the partial line he had copied beside it. He looked at the ledger open on the table and at Hargraves' hands hovering near the pages. The registrar's authority had moved the crates, but the quiet archivist's small ledger would outlast a single day's order. He tapped the copied page and then, with deliberate care, closed the ledger and walked to the window. He watched the street where the wagon had disappeared and then turned back to the room as students began to arrive. The quiet archivist breathed in the paper, scent and the warm beeswax of the lamp. He felt his suspicion still there, but quieter and sharpened into a plan. Protect names, preserve paper, and keep the records where someone could find them later. Outside the ledger room door, a clerk came to deliver a message. It will demand more action. The quiet archivist folded his hands around his lamp and said, "Bring it here." He looked at Hargraves and Thomas, then closed the ledger and began to copy the names he and the others had salvaged. The morning moved forward with measurable tasks, not declarations. A carriage would return from the city with receipts, questions, and perhaps an ally. The quiet archivist set his pen down, picked up the folio he had wrapped in cloth, and took one step toward the anteroom, where the next choice waited. He left the folio on the ledger desk under his ink-stained finger and did not look back as footsteps hurried away. The wagon booted against the stone and the quiet archivist stepped forward with his fingers still smelling of beeswax and dust. Suspicion pulled at him the moment he saw the foreman lift the ledger and cross a name from the manifest. The word he read there matched the oak row where his fingers had brushed bindings for 29 years. "Stop," he said, and the single syllable landed hard on the portico. Men shifted. The crate men looked to Foreman Briggs. Clerk Thomas opened his mouth and shut it. Before 5 breaths passed, the problem of the morning was made plain. Shelves were listed for removal, and someone had issued the order to take them away that day. Suspicion was the thread that set him moving. He did not wait to think. He stepped down the long stone steps, shawl gathered tight, and met Briggs at the wagon's flank. "Which shelves?" he asked. Which manifest line names them? The foreman slid the ledger under a thumb. The quiet archivist squinted at ink and number and felt the ledger's edge under his palm as if it were part of the building itself. He recognized the handwriting of the registrar only after he had seen the sealed stamp. That recognition pulled a new tightness through him. This was official. This was not a mistake. Within a few moments, voices gathered along the portico. Clerk Thomas, flushed and nervous, kept his ledger close. Young scholar Eliza came up the steps, hair pressed damp from the dawn, and said, "Those shelves, there are folios for my family's research in there." Her voice was small but direct. It was the first appeal in a morning that would demand more than polite phrases. The quiet archivist felt doubt arrive next, a cold calculation. Could he stop men with rope and horse? Could he persuade a registrar with a sealed decree? Doubt tightened his jaw, and he chose action instead of waiting for an answer. He intercepted the first crate in the threshold. The rope lines bit into his palms when he braced them. His fingers left smudges on the wood. Foreman Briggs barked, "Move, man," orders from Hawk. "We have names." The quiet archivist forced the crate wide with his shoulder. "Open it here." He said, "Open it now, in my sight." The foreman hesitated. A short argument held in a hard mouth. Clerk Thomas, nothing. The crate lid came up, and inside, under straw and twine, were volumes with labels the archivist recognized. He pulled a folio free and pressed it to his chest as if to prove their presence. The books were not anonymous bundles. They were labeled, annotated, and marginalia ran along their edges in the same scholar's hand that had been noted in his ledger months ago. The arrival of Eliza shifted the stakes. She stepped between the archivist and the men and touched the folio with fingers that trembled. "This is my grandmother's ledger," she said. "You cannot take that. It contains names no catalogue shows." Her plea made the removal into something personal. The quiet archivist watched her hands and listened to Hawk's seal at the registrar's name. He had suspected removal might be bureaucratic pruning. Seeing a named folio made the act suddenly human. That conversion from property to personhood tightened his decision. He could not let labeled traces of families be carried away without contest. Registrar Hawk appeared then, the sealed decree in his hand and the register under his arm. He read the clause aloud beside the brass lamp in the reading room, each phrase deliberate. "Items listed are subject to removal and disposal if deemed duplicate or obsolete," he declared. He set the decree down as if it were a physical instrument of force. "The institution requires space. We must consolidate," the quiet archivist replied with evidence instead of rhetoric. He produced a brass key from his satchel and unlocked the library ledger, letting their eyes fall on entries he had kept private. Names scrawled beside certain titles, donors' marks, and notations in his own hand about fragile bindings and unique marginalia. A clerk's bargain then surfaced like an undercurrent. Clerk Thomas leaned close to the archivist while the foreman and the registrar argued about transport. "I can delay some crates," Thomas whispered, voice low and sharp. "Give me a list. Hand me the titles and I will mark them as retained. I could do it for a month. For a promised position, Hawk will listen." The quiet archivist registered the choice in Thomas's tone. It was not loyalty but transaction. Betrayal arrived not as a shout but as a bargain. "You want a list," the archivist said. "I will not hand over names for you to bury in a drawer. You will sign a record in my presence." Thomas looked at Hawk, then away. The man in the linen shirt swallowed and, for a moment, seemed to weigh conscience against advantage. That hesitation was an emotional shift, from timidity to temptation to visible shame, and it reshaped the negotiation. While the grown men traded power in the reading room, the quiet archivist and Eliza moved through the oak aisles to check a single shelf noted on the manifest. He brushed dust away with the back of his hand, fingers trained to study spine and binding. The shelf revealed a false binding, an old deception. He slid it aside and found a rolled parchment tied with faded ribbon, the kind of ribbon that never belonged to catalogued dust. Eliza's hand trembled when she took it. "This is a ledger of names," she said. "This is why my grandmother came here. This is why she wrote." The discovery changed the moral weight of removal. What had been boxes of paper now had intentional concealment. Someone had hidden particular works, and the presence of that hiding suggested motive beyond mere consolidation. Across the portico, Foreman Briggs paced. Hawk has the mandate. We move when instructed. His voice carried an authority born of muscle and habit. He looked at the crate men and then at the registrar as if seeking permission and absolution at once. Briggs did not need to be cruel. He needed orders. The quiet archivist understood this and aimed his argument at the ledger instead of the foreman. He opened the ledger and read aloud the annotations by donors who had left books under condition. He read a note that asked the institution to keep certain folios accessible to named families. Hawk's face tightened. Those are advisory notes. Hawk, they are not binding under the new statute. The registrar's muscles around his mouth worked. He had prepared his decree to give him leverage. The ledger exposed an old compact, and the compact brought obligations into the light. Tension rose when Thomas returned with a half-formed offer. He placed himself between the foreman and the stacks and said, "Hawk, there are unique items here. If we retain a few, I can smooth the paperwork. A list now will spare the trouble later." Hawk shook his head. "We must prioritize space and the university's plans." "You know this, Thomas?" The discussion became a small argument, then a negotiation. The quiet archivist pushed the ledger toward Hawk. He pointed to entries where donors had specified named access for particular families. "Read this," he said. "These are not duplicates. They are single copies with marginalia you cannot reproduce." Hawk read and then read again. He for time to think. The archivist heard the registrar's hesitation and chose to press. He moved to the service door and put his shoulder against it, feeling the woods give under his coat. He barred the threshold with his weight, deliberately small and yet impossible to ignore. "You cannot move these today," he said. "Not until you account for the donor's requirements." A silence fell like a floorboard settling. The men on the wagon shifted their feet. Foreman Briggs wanted the day to run on schedule. Hawk wanted the mandate enforced. Clerk Thomas wanted advancement. Eliza wanted a folio for her lineage. The quiet archivist's body became the locus of conflict, his stance a physical demand that the institution acknowledge the ledger's contents. The ledger itself told another story. When he opened it under the lamp, his fingers moved with practiced faith. Names stretched like small flags alongside titles, donors, borrowers, notations of sections removed before, and one scroll in a different hand that read like a warning. Concealed for safety, the archivist traced that scrawl with the tip of a forefinger and felt a small shiver of recognition. He remembered the crate that had skidded weeks before, and how he had heard the wood scrape the floor. He had stopped that crate then. He remembered the notice hammered to the door in a previous evening. He had read that notice, too. The ledger linked those mornings. The discovery of the false binding and the rolled parchment made an earlier worry seem less accidental and more deliberate. The emotional movement in the room shifted again when the archivist read aloud a donor a stipulation that named access go to a particular family and forbade total disposal. "This is explicit," he said. "These are terms of donation." Hawk's hand dropped toward the seal on his decree. "Terms can be reconsidered." "Hawk, the statute is clear." Their voices rose in polite cadence. The quiet archivist refused to step back. He clerked Thomas to read sections and to place his signature under minutes taken in his presence. Thomas hesitated, then reached for a pen. Eliza watched Thomas sign with mouth pressed thin. The man who had mentioned promotion now left a visible mark in the ledger. That act shifted the power dynamic. A clerk had chosen to record constraints rather than bury them. A mid-chapter cliffhanger arrived in the form of a single line the registrar read from the ledger that neither Briggs nor Hawk expected. "Here," the quiet archivist, pointing. "This entry notes deliberate concealment. Someone hid items to protect names. That changes your authority to discard." Hawk's face hardened. He slapped the desk. Who hid them? He demanded. Who carried the concealment forward? The question hung. A new suspicion spread through the group. Removal might mean erasing more than paper. It might mean burying people whose names the books kept alive. A surprising reveal shifted the scene. clerk Thomas, cheeks empty of color, said, "I know who did the concealment." Silence followed. It was Registrar Harding before Hawke's predecessor left, Thomas. He ordered certain folios bound falsely and parcels placed in false shelves during the reforms. The revelation changed how the quiet archivists saw past events. The crate that had skidded before, the notice on the door weeks ago, and the sealed decree now read as a continuing thread of institutional reshaping. Harding feared controversy, Thomas added. He hid what he thought would bring trouble. Hawke wants to finish what Harding began. The confession functioned as a twist. The motive behind removal was not only space saving but also a will to tidy away complicated history. Arguments then became sharper. Hawke struck back with legal language. Briggs leaned on muscle. Eliza found her voice and spoke into the room. "You call it complicated. My grandmother called it life. Those pages record births, disputes, and names no ledger has copied. You will not take them without accounting for the families." Her speech was not theatrical. It was precise and contained facts she could cite, because she had read the covered folio. Hawke looked at her and found himself without a simple rebuttal. The quiet archivist watched Hawke's temper and found, in the registrar, small pauses and the way his knuckles whitened when he gripped the decree, the human friction that could be used. The climax arrived at the brass lamp over the central table. The quiet archivist produced the library's sealed ledger and set it between them like a proof. He read annotations that listed named access and recorded terms of donation. "These are not disposable without notice," he said. "These are not duplicates when donors asked otherwise." Briggs moved to lift a crate in protest. Hawke rose and slammed his hand near the ledger. The room smelled of horse oil and old glue. Words accelerated into sharp back and forth. "Hawke, Eliza, if you remove these, you erase people who use them to live and learn." Hawke's reply was short and procedural. "We preserve the institution's future." A rapid exchange followed where each name was invoked, each clause read aloud, and the ledger was used as evidence and appeal. In the middle of the argument, Clerk Thomas took a step few expected. He placed his own pen into Hawke's hand and said, "If you sign to record the exceptions, will you tell Briggs to leave those crates? Will you promise a review?" Hawke hesitated. He looked at Briggs, then at Thomas, who had, in earlier minutes, seemed eager for promotion. The man now looked as if he had chosen to anchor himself to a public record instead of personal gain. That choice altered the scene. The clerk's action forced Registrar Hawke to negotiate rather than dictate. It was a moral counterweight and a necessary pivot in the conflict. Negotiation followed. Hawke agreed, after a long pause, to spare fragile or named volumes pending formal review and to authorize removal only of duplicates. He insisted that the institution retained right to relocate holdings for preservation. "We will not burn anything without counsel." Hawke. The quiet archivist felt the reprieve like cold sun on his face. He had forced a concession without violence. Yet his relief included a new pressure. He had to act quickly to protect the small set of saved books. After the men had moved most crates away under redirected instruction, and the foreman had conceded on the named folios, the quiet archivist arranged for a handful of volumes to be shifted to a hidden alcove. He worked in quiet method. He wrapped pages in linen, noted catalog numbers in a private ledger, and sealed a small parcel for Eliza with a folio tied inside. His hands moved with the same care they had in other nights when the lamps were low and the university quiet. He recorded the saved titles in his private book, each entry deliberate. The physical acts, tying twine, dipping wax, sliding folio into a satchel, were the way he expressed grief and resourcefulness. Evening came, and with it a soft settling of tension. The wagon left at last, wheels thumping like a heartbeat in the courtyard. Night porter Mr. Albright stood by the service door and nodded to the quiet archivist, who had returned to the inner stacks. Eliza clasped her parcel and said, "Thank you, Mr. Reeves." She used his name plainly, the public recognition he rarely received. He inclined his head and replied, "Keep the folio safe." Read it with care. The archivist watched her go down the steps and vanish into the mist that gathers around the university's lane. That night the quiet archivist tended his lamp in the inner stacks. He set the brass key on the ledger and traced a title with a forefinger. He noted in his private record the names he had saved. Memory of the notice on the door and the crate that had skidded back in the corridor returned as concrete details. The clerk who had hammered the notice, the sound of wood against stone. He recorded each event in his own hand, ensuring the sequence of choices was preserved should anyone later question the decisions he had made. The act of noting felt less like defiance than duty. An aftertaste of unease lingered. The registrar had promised a review, but promises in institutions often shifted slowly. The quiet archivist knew this. He also knew that he had made visible the ledger's constraints and that Clerk Thomas had chosen to place a public mark of retention. Those facts together would make later erasure more difficult. He walked the stacks once more and checked each parcel. A small rolled parchment sat on the windowsill, rain still smudging the glass outside. He tied the parchment to the folio for Eliza and placed it under the lamp. Gold. The room smelled of wax and paper and a faint trace of pipe smoke he carried from his coat. The final moments were quiet and concrete. He sealed the ledger with his key and clicked the lock. He set a note on the desk for Mr. Albright to deliver to the registrar in the morning. A request for a recorded meeting with family representatives and named donors. He left no grand speech. He left a list and a set of signatures. In the corridor, as he closed the service door, he felt his shoulders loosen by a measure and then tighten again with the knowledge that compromise required vigilance. He had preserved a small set of books, recorded names, and forced acknowledgement. The night settled. The brass lamp guttered softly. He walked to the window, placed the parcel for Eliza on the sill, and waited until the rain light reflected the lamp gold, then drew the curtain and turned the bolt on the ledger's case. In the final beat, before the stacks emptied into the slow breathing of the building, a faint knock came at the outer door. He unlatched a bolt and listened to footsteps on the stone steps. The sound belonged to Mr. Albright returning with a message. Hawke had agreed to the recorded exceptions and would present the matter at the next council. The quiet archivist wrote the registrar's name down in his private ledger and added Clerk Thomas's signature as witness. He marked the parcels for Eliza and for the small group of named families, then sat and tended the lamp until the flames steadied. He set the ledger closed, the brass key resting on top, and in the last action of the night, he placed the sealed parcel intended for Eliza on the table, where the lamplight would keep it warm for anyone who came by morning. That physical act, setting a parcel into view, was not a reflection but a decision. The books would wait, and so would the people who needed them. The quiet archivist locked the reading room and pushed the service door shut. His shoulder a final barrier until council met and named hands could reclaim what had been promised.